Is it better to have loved and lost, or to have never loved at all? In Charlie Kaufman's mind-bending and emotionally raw depiction of Love Gone Wrong, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is a timeless look at the resilience of real love in the face of loss. A love story played out in reverse, we're made to question the emotional costs of love, the allure of forgetting, and what it means to willingly give up the memories that define us. Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet portray two deeply flawed and deeply human lovers who choose to escape the fallout of their failed romance by erasing their memories of having ever loved or lost. Was the pain of their relationship worth the beauty of their connection? Or are they better off without it? Is erasing the heartbreak also erasing the joy? Or is it an act of self-preservation? The stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the past make some connections impossible to forget. On this episode of Dr. The Psychology, let's take a closer look at how we find meaning in love and loss, and the subconscious patterns that shape our instincts whether we want them to or not. The ties that bind. Joel and Clementine are two quirky New Yorkers who find themselves drawn to each other for reasons neither can explain. Though when the movie opens we appear to be witnessing the day they meet, the narrative quickly shifts into some unknown time later when the relationship has already ended. Most of the movie takes place only in the reality of Joel's mind. We see little of the actual timeline. What we learn about this relationship is almost entirely from his perspective. The nonlinear structure is not only a plot device for clever and creative storytelling, it's an illustration of the larger themes around how emotions shape memory. In the nonlinear narrative, we begin with the final fight that causes Clementine to abruptly end their relationship without really knowing why. When a story's told out of order, it changes how we make sense of it. The viewer doesn't know if they should be happy or sad that these two people are no longer together. Without context, Clementine's choice to erase her memories might seem like an extreme reaction to a fight about drunk driving and being irresponsible. We can't make meaning of her behavior until we have the pool of information around it. In this fictional movie, a company called Lacuna Inc. has pioneered technology that can isolate neural pathways and excise the memories encoded there. The neuroscience of the procedure as described to Joel is actually pretty sound. A lacuna is a gap, a missing part, or a void in something that would otherwise be whole. This is literally the company's ethos, to create gaps in people's memories. The procedure starts with the most recent memories and works its way backward. There's an emotional core, the doctor explains, to each of our memories. Once you eradicate that core, it starts the degradation process. Even without the benefit of today's technology to map associative neural networks, Freud deduced the process of Bindung. This German word for binding describes how libido is bound to thoughts, memories, or objects by the force of emotional cathexis. Libido here doesn't just mean physical sexual impulses. Libido is conceptualized as a psychic energy or drive that flows from all the desires, pleasures, and instincts of the id. To cathect libido means to direct the force or projection of the investment of emotional energy. Cathexis creates a powerful and sometimes unbreakable psychological link between the emotional stimuli of the id and the specific ideas, people, objects, and experiences it binds to. Alternately termed the life instinct, investment of libido is the root of all human gratification. When we're unfulfilled in life, it's because we have no objects in which to cathect libido. Creating the lacuna is essentially the unbinding of Joel's emotional cathexis from Clementine. He's instructed to collect everything he owns that has an association to her. As they go through the objects one by one, Joel thinks through their meaning. The thoughts that arise map the associative links between emotions, memories, and sense of self. What exists in the mind must exist out there, and what exists out there must invariably also exist in the mind. An internal object is just a mirror of what was once an external object. The fact that internal things are always linked to external things makes it clear why this procedure would never work in real life. For example, the cards Lacuna sends to the patient's family and friends asking them to never mention the erased person would require an unrealistic amount of collusion and coordination from an untold number of people. Imagine if you erase someone, but your friends kept slipping up and mentioning them. The ability to link the internal object to the external object that put it there is crucial for understanding why we do the things that we do. Binding, or thought linking as we call it at our practice, is how we make the unconscious conscious. Without the associative map, emotions will be misperceived or linked to the wrong thing. Divorced from their context, thoughts and feelings lack meaning, choices become chaotic, and the conscious rationale behind decision-making may have no link whatsoever to what the person actually feels. Kernberg describes personality organization as the progressive integration and hierarchical structuring of motivational systems derived from effective memory structures. This is essentially object relations as a theory. The primary motivational system is one of affects, emotions based on memories of what we did and didn't feel at our earliest root, the mother-child relationship. It's self-explanatory. The self-object relates to the other object, bound together by an affect. These self, other, affect triads form the relationship models that serve as the primary force guiding us toward pleasure and away from pain. Interactions formed under the dominance of peak affect states internalize in effective memory structures as preverbal knowing. These object relations, at our structural core, are what guides the subconscious outside of conscious thought. Any sort of stimuli associated with peak positive states motivate us to approach, maintain, and enhance conditions that foster pleasure. Object relations linked by peak negative states become aversive stimuli, which we're driven to avoid and escape. Attachment style is shaped by these preverbal relationship models, constituting our primary but unarticulated motivational drive. We see several ways these effective memory structures drive Joel and Clementine's behavior. When they meet again, after both having erased the other, they're both motivated by a subconscious urge to go to the beach in Montauk where they originally met. The frozen-over Charles River clearly has some sort of deeply rooted emotional significance for Clementine. It grounds her when she's feeling unmoored, and fosters deeper emotional connection when she shares it with others. Joel's initially drawn to Clementine because of the distinctive orange sweatshirt she wears, both times they meet. The same peak positive association eventually turns peak negative for Joel as their relationship sours. He grows to hate it. Our emotional milieu is linked to the external circumstances in which they happen, which become part of the effective memory structure. The non-linear storytelling hints at something important about what happens when object triads become disorganized. Once Joel arrives at the emotional core of their relationship, the twinned memories of when Clementine opens up fully, and when Joel experiences peak happiness with her at the Charles. His recollections become surreal, nonsensical, and distorted. When self-experience gets organized around emotions rather than the cause and effect of chronology, object relations become chaotic. Instead of a narrative, a person's thoughts will zip from thing to thing in a flight of ideas. Objects are no longer linked in a way that keeps progressing hierarchically from the primary emotional drive. Meaning is lost amongst a sea of affects disconnected from their pool of context. The deeper the web of associations, the harder they would be to untangle. So when we see Clementine react so strongly to that last fight, we have to hold that external thing in mind on one layer, and then simultaneously reach inward and dig around to find out what it's connected to. Unbound, those specific thoughts and feelings would no longer trigger the object triad. Difficulty with thought linking is indicative of disorganized effective memory structures. In other words, in real life and in Lacuna's procedure, this is a mechanism of dissociation. This defense mechanism is an attempt to protect the self from pain at the expense of a cohesively organized psyche. Dissociation blocks the integration of the emotional mind, the lower limbic system, with the thinking mind, the higher cerebral cortex. People that are highly dissociative have difficulty with both encoding and retrieving memories. Many times the goal of therapeutic work is to retrieve and reintegrate material that has been dissociatively split off. This is what causes those breakthroughs of understanding and help to make the self whole. In a nutshell, Lacuna deliberately dissociates effects from their objects. Once Joel reverts back to the core of his cathexis for Clementine, he wants to stop the procedure, to keep their relationship, at least on the inside, if not on the outside. And here they hit us with even more suggestive ideas about memory and emotion. Joel's inner representation of Clementine suggests that he hide her in emotions and memories where she doesn't belong, places she wasn't originally linked. He travels back to childhood memory structures and tries to hide her in triads linked by shame, embarrassment, and need. These are the emotions he refused to share and open up about with Clementine, cementing their internal bond in a way that he was unable to do externally. When there's a silence, a dissociative block, it creates a barrier to closeness. Nobody typically wants a negative closeness, but it's still a way of maintaining the connection. The good overshadows the bad, but only if we can still feel it. And it gets lost when the external bad creates too much distance from the internal good. Who we are is constructed from our relationships, of which our actions are only a part. If the internal object disappears, we disappear. If you get rid of the emotional core, you get rid of its web. Internal working models of attachment. We repeat mistakes over and over again when we're unable to learn from experience. Instead of recognizing how and why something went wrong, we walk into every new scenario making the same choices that doomed the last one. Inability to adapt to specific situations ensures the same outcome regardless of circumstances. It requires a certain level of self-awareness to see patterns. Joel and Clementine's relationship seems to follow a consistent pattern: attraction, conflict, disillusionment. What initially attracts them eventually repels them. This is because the peak states motivating their behavior are at opposite ends of the attachment spectrum. Passionate, spontaneous, and dynamic, Clementine feels her emotions intensely and desires closeness and deep emotional engagement in her relationships. The fact that Joel is passive and emotionally withdrawn means that for the most part, he can contain rather than amplify her already intense emotions. In many ways, Clementine is a needed source of vitality in his otherwise stagnant life. He's somewhat dependent on her to feel emotionally alive, and views her as the solution to his numbness. He doesn't truly come alive without her influence. While these contrasts are initially complementary, they're destined to eventually become sources of friction and frustration. He'll eventually find her overstimulating, and she'll eventually find him understimulating. He'll get overwhelmed, and she'll get bored. Because they're both on extreme ends of opposite poles, time will reveal that Joel has a need for distance, and Clementine has a need for closeness. We all have a preference for the amount of emotional stimulation that feels fulfilling. Some need more, and some need less. Clementine's closeness feels intrusive to Joel, causing him to turn inward away from her. This is the classic push-pull of a relationship between dismissive and anxious attachment. What makes Clementine feel secure feels threatening and overpowering for Joel. The intensity of her emotional stimulation would be difficult for Joel to manage if he tried to match it. She approaches, he avoids. The needier and more demanding she becomes, the greater his need to withdraw, creating emotional distance that only makes her more reactive in her fear of abandonment. In normal, secure attachment, we approach to achieve closeness and avoid to prevent the intrusiveness that results in aversive stimuli. The same thing is individually experienced as good or bad dependent on its effective motivation. Strong emotions are encoded as aversive for Joel and appetitive for Clementine. This disparity reflects discordant needs around emotional intimacy. Rather than physical intimacy, emotional intimacy refers to feeling completely safe being vulnerable and opening up. There is no fear of rejection and no fear of judgment. In Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, Lindsay Gibson writes, "People who are emotionally immature are too self-preoccupied to notice the inner experience of others. They discount feelings, are uncomfortable with their own emotional needs, and therefore have no idea how to offer support on an emotional level. They fear emotional intimacy. They get nervous or angry in the face of conflict, causing the other person to shut down the urge to reach out, closing the door to emotional contact." Joel's withdrawn and reserved nature causes him to be more emotionally immature than Clementine, biasing on self-protection and moving backward, rather than vulnerability and moving forward. Although Joel is more externally responsible, Clementine is more internally authentic. Disparate emotional intimacy leaves both parties feeling misunderstood and emotionally dissatisfied, although neither are wrong, per se. They just won't meet in the middle where their poles are imbalanced. These are two people that are hurt by each other that are not actively trying to hurt each other. Every subtype of insecure attachment has one thing in common: a parent-child relationship at the person's core that somehow failed to consistently meet attachment needs. The parent failed to achieve an optimal tension in the approach void of the child's dependency. In order to secure attachment, both parties need to correctly attune the amount of distance that would be over or under stimulating for the other, and be able to goal correct if there's a misalignment. A lot of people think the connection itself is the attachment, but it's not. It's a relationship that endures over time because both parties are able to course correct when they fall out of sync. Secure attachment exists in the realm of 50-50 or 60-40, and insecure attachment styles drift off into the outer rungs. The distance becomes harder and harder to bridge, the more opposite the extremes. And relationships between dismissive men and anxious women are pretty common. Dismissive attachment is a way of coping with a parent who rejects the child's need for both physical and emotional closeness, but typically parents in a controlling or domineering way. The attachment system is deactivated rather than continually face the pain and disappointment of unmet needs. Anxious attachment, on the other hand, hyperactivates the attachment system, amplifying distress in the hopes of eliciting an inconsistent parent's care. The parent is either too close or too far away, and the child responds by use of the opposite strategy, either moving toward or away from the parent. Gibson also describes the outcome of the absence of emotional intimacy, emotional loneliness. You may have thought feeling empty and alone was your own private, strange experience, she writes, something that made you different from other people. As a child, you had no way of knowing that this hollow feeling is a normal, universal response to lacking adequate human companionship. This type of loneliness isn't an odd or senseless feeling. It's the predictable result of growing up without sufficient empathy from others. Mutual emotional responsiveness is the single most essential ingredient of human relationships. Without mutual responsiveness, relationships are marred by pervasive fears of rejection and abandonment. These anxieties come to define attachment needs. Clementine and Joel don't understand that they have the same fears because they're using opposite strategies to cope with them. And we're able to see the root of each's deeply rooted pain, but only because Clementine, in the external world, actually shared hers. Together, hidden underneath blankets, Clementine seeks Joel's confirmation that she's worthy. She says as a child, her favorite toy was an ugly girl doll that she named after herself. She'd hit it over and over and shout, "You can't be ugly, be pretty." She externalized her internal feelings, a powerful expression of the inner turmoil and the loneliness and unworthiness she felt as a child. She believed she must have been ugly on the outside because she didn't feel loved on the inside. It's this moment of true vulnerability and real intimacy where Joel realizes he can't lose her. This is the emotional core of their relationship, the one time they met in the middle with complete openness and safety, with mutual understanding, reassurance, and no rejection. This memory comes first in the reverse storyline, meaning Joel's moment of vulnerability actually happened before that. When Joel, who's lived such an emotionally deadened life, finally feels joy being with her on the Charles, he says, "I could die right now, Clem. I'm just happy. I've never felt that before. I'm just exactly where I want to be." This is significant because they finally met each other on the opposite side. Joel finally gave Clem the big emotions she seeks, and it made her feel safer to share the depth of her own. And Clementine mirrored the shame of feeling unworthy that Joel can't face in himself. And so we only see that fear in Joel in his memories. His guardedness is explained at his structural root, feeling ignored and unseen by his mother as she hosts a guest. He felt as a child, "No one ever looks at me," as he literally hides underneath a table. His adult psyche is amazed at how overpowering the need to be held is. That's the overstimulation of attachment needs, which dismissive attachment must inevitably turn off. But Joel also goes back further and tries to bury Clementine in his memory of deepest safety. Being bathed in the sink, Joel describes a feeling of security with such obvious contentment that Clementine remarks she's never seen him happier. Notably, his mother sings the same song to Joel that Clementine routinely teases about when she meets new people, not to make fun of her name using the Huckleberry Hound song. When they meet the first time, Joel knows the song, and even shares that his favorite toy as a child was a Huckleberry Hound doll. When they meet after they've both been erased, he tells her he's never heard of the song. By looping Clementine into this associative link, the lacuna also erases his deepest structure of childhood security, the collateral damage of splitting off the emotions of the core self. Here, perhaps intuitively, the film communicates something deeply complex. If our affective memory structures are rooted in security, we risk contaminating the core relational model if we extend it to someone who hurts us. Real-life Joel literally begins to choke as Stan, the Lacuna employee, yanks this memory away, which wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. It would literally kill him to lose that memory. It's significant that Joel shows two oppositely valenced roots here, both the intensity of his mother's rejection and the intensity of her security. Joel tried to link Clementine to both his deepest love and his deepest loneliness. This paradox is reflected in Joel's attraction to Clementine from the beginning, and we see this in their initial meeting. He feels an immediate intimacy with her as she unthinkingly shares his food, but ultimately runs away from her because he feels humiliated by her perceived rejection. In a sense, he links all of the intensity of his feelings for Clementine to the depths of shame and safety. He entwines her idealization with his devaluation. He tries to link her to his core. If Joel maps his highest good with his highest bad, does that mean he could learn from his mistakes if they tried again? That seems to be the wrong question. What does it really matter? It has to be both. If you're looking for a definitive answer on whether or not this is a story of people who are destined to be together, or who just keep making the same mistakes, you're missing the point. We're all of our good and all of our bad, all of our best and all of our worst. Peak affective states define who we are, whether they're good or bad, because they're the things that matter. That they conflict only means they have to be reconciled. For better or worse, we love who we love, for better or worse. Joel and Clementine's alterations between affection and avoidance foster an unwitting cycle of rejection that neither party intends. Clementine wants to see herself as she is, and Joel wants to be seen by others. Ultimately, maladaptive coping from insecure attachment provokes exactly what's trying to be prevented: rejection and abandonment. The subconscious pull behind such self-defeating strategies comes from the core of who we are, in knowing that exists without words. Approaching where there's acceptance and avoiding where there's rejection, the psychological motivational system that defines secure attachment, isn't going to work if we approach and avoid the wrong things. Idealization. For the real self or the false self? From the moment we meet her, Clementine is insistent about who she is. She's comfortable in her own skin and refuses to be misunderstood. She voluntarily shares with Joel that she is vindictive, but he denies that he thinks that about her. When she says her personality comes from the jars of paste she uses to color her hair, Joel thinks he's complimenting her to deny it. After he continually calls her nice, even when her behavior obviously shows she doesn't want to be perceived that way, she finally gets annoyed at him and snaps. Clementine knows who she is and works hard to ensure others know it too. She's telling him directly how she should be understood, and he keeps contradicting her and refusing to listen. She's annoyed not only because he's missing her emotional nuances, but because he keeps defying what she is directly telling him. Joel keeps getting it wrong and she refuses to engage with him unless he can get it right, forcing her to become almost antagonistic. Refusal to acknowledge the bad is a defining feature of dismissive attachment. Regardless of what Clementine tells him, Joel sees what he wants to see, even going so far as to invalidate her self-knowledge. She seems to have learned from experience to expect men to respond to her in ways that miss or ignore her interiority. Clementine doesn't feel the need to be seen in purely positive terms. She doesn't seem to feel that she's derogating herself if she makes self-deprecating jokes or openly acknowledges her flaws. She wants her shortcomings and negative traits to be recognized and accepted for what they are, not overlooked or minimized. Being praised does not replace being understood. Clementine's ability to engage with her faults in emotionally neutral ways suggests a positive self-image. When she finally opens up about the ugly doll story, what she's really communicating is that she's internalized the view that her worth is primarily connected to her idealized exterior, with the real self going unseen and unloved. Rejection of the psychological self causes intense shame that the very being is unacceptable. She compensates by emphasizing and forcing recognition of her devalued, sometimes volatile interior. But when abandonment fears threaten disintegration, Clementine is reassured via confirmation of her beauty, and therefore her worth. This contrasts sharply with Joel's need to avoid rejection at the expense of acceptance of the self. Clementine's frequent entreaties that he open up are met with deflecting replies that he's boring and his life isn't interesting. He won't show what she's asking to see. Joel consciously endorses a negative self-image, but this too is a compensatory defense. No one can judge the worth of the inner self if they never get to see it. So you can protect the hope that maybe it's good. Analysis from us at Dr. The Psychology is aimed at introducing our own independently formulated modality, which we named ego integration theory. It's based heavily on Kleinian object relations, particularly the paranoid schizoid position in the first half of development and the depressive position on the other, separated by what we call the narcissistic split, but what Margaret Mahler calls separation and individuation. The paranoid schizoid phase of development is essentially the growing awareness of the infant ego in relation to mothers, and is for complicated reasons, dominated by the question of friend or foe. In the depressive position, the child learns that the same mother who nurtures is the same mother who deprives, and begins to feel guilt for harming the loved object who gratifies with the aggression toward the object who frustrates. We cannot reconcile idealization and devaluation without accessing the depressive position. Personality disorders are the result of fixation or psychological arrested development at one of the phases of development prior to and including the narcissistic split. It's going to take time to explain the full scope of ego integration theory, but it's simply a new frame on already established theory. Suffice it to say, without accessing the depressive position, an individual will have inherently impaired empathy, difficulty reconciling good and bad dichotomous thinking, and making reparation in attachment relationships. Clementine can comfortably look at herself with realistic integration, but Joel can't. He views Clementine as alternately idealized and alternately devalued. This perspective ineluctably expects perfection. To reconcile her as both would have to be to recognize her as imperfect. Maladaptive strategies that prevent integration sustain a fragile emotional equilibrium by avoiding intimacy and emotional contact, thereby minimizing poorly tolerated conflict. But it also prevents the realization that the idealized and devalued object are facets of one whole. Denying and devaluing the worth of others, just as Joel constantly devalues himself, cripples the ability to accept flaws. A big part of the reason Clementine is so firm about her presentation in relationships is because she knows men view her as an idealized concept and miss the real self. She knows she will inevitably fall short of their unrealistically high expectations. Themes of superficial idealization are more overtly expressed in the storylines of Lacuna employees Patrick and Mary. Patrick pursues a relationship with Clementine despite only meeting her when she was unconscious, the perfect target for his projections of the ideal woman. He doesn't even attempt to get to know her himself. Joel's already done that work for him. By copying and recreating the exact same moments that made her fall in love with Joel, he treats her as if the same script would work on her regardless of who it comes from. He objectifies her outside and dehumanizes her inside. The outside, the object, is disconnected from the inside, the affect. He calls her Tangerine, even though he didn't even know her when her hair was orange, so it doesn't actually even mean anything. That nickname only has special meaning between Clementine and Joel. When he passes off a present Joel bought as his own, Clementine is confused instead of flattered that he knows her taste so well so soon. Patrick has unusually intimate knowledge of her inner world that she knows has been historically difficult for other partners to understand. Connection doesn't come from having the right answer, but from mutual understanding. Joel and Clementine took the time to get to know each other as individuals. His approach is doomed to fail. Patrick, overall, demonstrates what's called a compulsively compliant attachment strategy. It's part of dismissive attachment strategies that deny or distort what a person really feels. Instead, they believe attachment is secured by doing what the attachment figure wants, especially angry or threatening ones. You must comply. The concept of attachment is associatively bound to caregiving and a belief that approval, safety, and security are conditional. Relationships are contingent on good behavior, performing correctly and always getting it right. It's safer to stick with known behaviors that will elicit approval than risk displeasing the other, fearing damage to the attachment. It's a clear, achievable goal as a strategy for security. People-pleasing is actually compulsive compliance, and it makes relationships transactional. One's value is chiefly tied to fulfilling perceived duties and satisfying the other's expectations. In return, compulsively anticipating the other's needs is meant to be repaid with safety and control. It reduces conflict, the unexpected and the unpredictable, but at the expense of true connection. Compulsive compliance is not only a form of covertly controlling behavior, it can only secure a relationship on the outside that's tethered by nothing on the inside. Patrick's idealization of Clementine would have increased the pressure to get it right, as idealized figures are viewed as deserving of perfect compliance. If you simplify your partner into a perfect thing, you don't have to engage with the messiness of their full humanity. Focusing on the other this way also creates emotional distance because emotions that might create conflict are sidestepped as too messy, shameful, or unsafe to address, including one's own needs. Patrick tried to secure a relationship without the vulnerability and intimacy that comes with both parties meeting the actual needs of the self for the other. The end result is the same as Joel: emotional loneliness. Joel distanced with devaluation, and Patrick with idealization. Neither saw Clementine fully from both sides. They're both dismissive of the authentic emotion needed for connection. It's important to note here that it's only insecure attachment styles that result in imbalanced, oscillating idealization and devaluation. All forms of insecure attachment distort, amplify, or minimize thoughts and emotions. Either knowing what you feel or knowing what happened can't enter conscious awareness in order to protect from feelings of worthlessness. The conscious and subconscious are not aligned. All forms of insecure attachment, even dismissive attachment, have a negative shame-based self-image. The grandiosity associated with dismissiveness is a narcissistic defense, distortions from the false self. The only way to correctly decide if the self-image is positive or negative is if conscious thoughts, what we tell ourselves about ourselves, and subconscious feelings, how we feel about ourselves, match. When they don't, the devalued and idealized parties are constantly fluctuating because it's unclear who in the relationship is or isn't getting their needs met because needs aren't being expressed. The devalued and idealized parties are constantly fluctuating. There's no need for the securely attached individual to do that because they have an expectation that they're worth, and in fact insist on, having their needs met. When a positive self-image is paired with a mostly positive view of others in general, devaluation is only used in service of accurate judgment of the other's shortcomings. Being dismissive of emotions in general ensures neither party's emotional needs get met, and that relationships aren't based on emotional connection, which you'd think would be kind of obvious. Unfortunately for Patrick, Clementine's authenticity means she can feel the difference between connections that are and aren't based on the real self. Clementine tries to rely on Patrick, much like she relied on Joel, when she felt her inner self disappearing. She realizes she needs to ground herself with another visit to the Charles. She's trying to get back on the map. She lost part of herself when she lost Joel. Quite literally, a part of her internal world, something with deep emotional meaning, is no longer anchored to anything. Without an object, libido will fall into the void. Lacking the sense of connection that comes from being deeply seen by the other, she's quite literally trying to find herself again in the external world. But Patrick takes advantage of the opportunity to try to reenact another Joel lacuna. It feels empty, coming from him. When he repeats verbatim Joel's most heartfelt words of connection and intimacy, it seems to visibly ping to Clementine as an almost dangerous incongruency. It causes an emotional dissonance that's jarring, even invasive, within Clementine's deeply rooted associative mapping. Alarmed, she quickly sits up and runs off the Charles, with Patrick confused and lumbering after her. The overfamiliarity in Patrick's attempts at connection are deceptive, intrusive closeness, and alienating distance. He's simultaneously far too close to her real self, and way too far away from his own. The dissonance of this strategy works as all insecure attachment strategies do, as an inversion of the direction of things that would actually secure attachment. Generally speaking, the only people who try to achieve attachment by deceptive means, and by use of a false self, are trying to take advantage of you. Patrick's access to her inner world is obviously unrealistic due to the plot device of a lacuna. But in real life, there's always a similar underhanded mechanism at work when a sincere person finds themselves in a relationship with a manipulative one. Remember, we're defined by how we're seen in the eyes of others. It becomes a mutually reinforcing cycle. Rejection begets rejection and acceptance begets acceptance. Joel devalues himself, so he devalues Clementine. For optimistic Secretary Mary, she values our initial innocence, which is lost to maturation, and views Lacuna's owner Howard as returning damaged adults to the newness and psychological purity of childhood. Writ large, the effect is potentially eliminating all pain in the world. Her idealized attraction to Howard is less about romance and more about a psychological need to be mirrored by someone she projects onto as doing exceptional good. In practice, though, this idealizes Howard to an impossible standard of kindness he could never measure up to, a realization that becomes all the more traumatic once she learns he used the procedure to take advantage of her. She thinks he doesn't know how she feels, but he does, because she'd already acted on her feelings once before. They'd had an affair, which she erased when it damaged Howard's marriage, and ended with Mary having an abortion. The abortion was cut from the final film, but it's in the script. Even here, a bad thing gets minimized to preserve at least a little sympathy for Howard's character, without which he might seem like an outright monster. If you minimize, you can stay a little attached. When she finds this out after Howard's wife, an external anchor, catches them in the act, the extreme disillusionment of her idealization triggers an identity crisis. She equated what Howard does, his occupation, with who he is. Symbol is object. Smashing this fusion causes Mary to question how she got it so wrong. He's not a man with uncommon goodness. He's a man capable of exploiting and abusing an imbalance of power in the worst way. Such a deep deception and betrayal damages not only Mary herself, but her ideals. Her belief in goodness itself is damaged because she equated a fallible human with the representation of an ideal. Despite the lacuna, she continued to idealize Howard without consciously knowing why. The libido will always search for contact with an object. The lacuna's unbinding meant she was deprived of the opportunity to see Howard for who he really is. Removing the external actions left her with a misjudgment of his character. The tool she so greatly admired was used to harm her. Mary loved the idea of helping to free people from unendurable pain, until she realized she was one of them, someone so deeply damaged that the only way out was a lacuna. She couldn't see Howard accurately, because she saw him as something too closely connected to her values. Mary quits on the spot and mails all the patients their records, including the tapes recording the memories erased by the lacuna. She now sees the erasure as a manipulation of autonomy. By returning the tapes, essentially filling in the gap created by the lacuna, she's making a moral choice that people deserve to have their inner and outer congruent. Confronting pain is essential for emotional growth. Undergoing the procedure was a way of preserving his idealized self at her own expense. Idealization, in a way, justified her view of him as a good man, and their love as worth the pain. Her idealization is altruistic in contrast to the others, who bias on devaluing, not idealizing, the loved object. You can't integrate a devalued object without devaluing yourself, and maybe this explains why Mary was able to so clearly confront the truth. She accepted head-on that Howard's selfish and self-serving, nothing like the man she thought he was, continuing to invite her advances despite knowing how it would end for Mary. He probably would have, and almost did do it again, even though he knew how much it would damage her. This is devastating for a number of reasons, not least of all because Mary would have blamed herself for pursuing him. He tells her she chose the lacuna because she wanted to move on, only to potentially traumatize her again in the same way. Without the external truth, Mary could never have known her idealization was based on a distorted view of their relationship. Not only can she see that that's true now, she can see that it was true before too. We will repeat our mistakes if we don't learn why the consequences of them were severe enough to disconnect in the first place. You'll hear from us over and over again at Dr. The Psychology about how the root of the most severe forms of mental illness result from a refusal or inability to access emotional pain. A spotless mind has no blemishes. Stan, whom Mary is outwardly dating, may be the most decent guy in the film. He's the only one who knows everything that did and didn't happen, whose memory is intact and is not using it to manipulate anyone else. He's in the difficult position of navigating all sides of reality that not everyone around him has. Stan is the lone example of learning from thought linking as is, while also respecting the autonomy of others. Mary might be able to see Stan is an appropriate choice of a partner, but it will never be able to compete with someone idealized. For better or worse, perfection is always more enticing than being flawed, even when the perfection isn't actually real. And it never is. Because no one is perfect. Eternal sunshine of the spotless mind, each prayer accepted and each wish resigned. The common thread between those that go through life with their own lacunas is an inability to deal with confrontation and emotional complexity, wanting to revert back to a world untainted by pain. Idealization and devaluation are necessary defenses in order to progress to the depressive position and view people realistically, but only if they're used in service of accuracy, not to bolster or flee the ego. Idealized figures have to be brought down with accurate awareness of what would devalue them, and loved all the more for their imperfections. A person shouldn't require perfection in order to be loved. The difference between Joel and Clementine is that Clementine was clear about who she was, and Joel hid it. She wanted to be accepted for the true self, and he wanted to be someone acceptable. Clementine has to demand others understand she's not a concept or a symbol, but a real self with wants and needs. She doesn't want to be used to make someone else feel alive. She couldn't be clearer about this with Joel in the famous speech that launched 1,000 gifts, and he admits he still expected her to save his life. If you need the object that badly, there's nothing in your unrealistic distortion that could devalue them. The integration of good and bad means they're inseparable and always will be, even if the person no longer exists. The internal one does, as long as you keep it. Hey guys, we feel like we talked your ear off enough about this great film that we weren't even able to get into all the depth of the story. A part 2, which will break down the memories themselves and Joel's personality structure, will have to come later for Patreon subscribers. These episodes are written from a script, translated with text-to-speech, and cut together manually. So far, the scripts were so robust we didn't have time to get in everything we wanted. As we learn more about how to shape the podcast, it's becoming clear that analysis may exist on one level, and then we may have to go back to talk specifically about the plot. Topical observation, wouldn't you say? Our team is small, but studious, and it takes time for us to create what we do. So we ask that you be a little patient with us as we build our brand to ensure what we create meets the standard of quality you deserve. I'm Dan with Dr. The Psychology, and as always, if you like this episode, like and subscribe and tell your friends. Take care, and try to look at the people in your lives with just a little bit more beauty.